Hello, everyone, and welcome to OLC Live, a weekly broadcast on blockchain, branded tokens, and token economies. We feature weekly guests to discuss the latest in blockchain and the current projects that they are working on. And on this episode, we're going to be discussing Ethereum Name Service. Some of you might have already used the system. Some of you might have never heard of it. But with us today, we have somebody from Ethereum Name Service, and he is Nick Johnson. He is a lead developer at ENS, and he is also a core developer for go-ethereum, also referred to as Geth. Nick, thank you so much for joining us on OC Live.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about your background. You're heavily involved with Ethereum. Can you give us a history about your involvement with Ethereum?
Sure. So about 3 years ago, I was living and working in London, and hadn't really, heard a lot about Ethereum. I knew about Bitcoin. I, sort of hadn't really spent a lot of time with it. And I actually got contacted by a recruiter asking, would I like to come work at this company and work on Ethereum? And I went, well, no, not really, but this Ethereum thing sounds interesting, and started looking into it and then playing around with it and then writing stuff for it, and sort of never really looked back. And I've been, working on one part of Ethereum or another ever since.
Great. So what was sort of that first part of Ethereum that you started to work on?
So I guess the very first thing I wrote was actually a library in Solidity for manipulating strings, because there's no built-in support in Solidity for that. And I started, toying around with some Solidity stuff and some lower level stuff, and then got contacted by the Go Ethereum team, basically saying, would you like to come work on Go Ethereum? Would you like to interview for that? And having by that time been completely hooked by the whole, decentralized web story, I enthusiastically agreed.
So how long have you been with Go Ethereum?
So I worked on, like, directly on Go Ethereum for about a year, but I picked up working on ENS, like building ENS from the ground up, uh, almost the day I started on Go Ethereum, because I was talking to the Swarm team. They needed a naming service. They didn't really have one. Internet infrastructure is one of the things that really enthuses me. I find it really interesting. So I started working sort of more or less in my spare time on building what is now the first version of ENS. So I was on the Go Ethereum team as a core member for about a year, maybe a little longer. But I started finding that ENS was taking up more and more of my time.
Great, and let's go over a little history about ENS. So for those that know or like are involved with Ethereum but haven't heard about ENS, can you tell us sort of the basics of what is Ethereum Name Service?
Yeah. So ENS's primary goal is that users shouldn't have to deal with these long hexadecimal identifiers, 0x, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., 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 in any DApp or any interaction, because they're long, they're not human readable, they're very easy to mistype if you have to type them. They're easily replaced with other ones because people don't examine them closely. Generally, they're a bit of a usability nightmare. And unlike Bitcoin, whose base layer is relatively inflexible and orientated entirely around transaction processing, in Ethereum, we have the flexibility to improve this. We can build a system that lets us assign human-readable names to blockchain identifiers, and that's ENS's first and primary goal, is to just eliminate blockchain identifiers for users everywhere. They should be as rare as an end user typing an IP address into their browser.
Great, yeah, and I appreciate what you guys are doing, solving for that or making a better user experience for the people that are using blockchain. And you might get this question a lot, which is, how can you compare ENS with DNS? I guess the question that you might get a lot is, do you guys hope to sort of replace DNS? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So ENS heavily draws inspiration from DNS. In fact, the first version of ENS was basically almost a transcription of DNS onto the blockchain. I quickly realized that there were a number of improvements we could make because DNS wasn't designed for the same sort of architecture that the blockchain runs on, though there's a better way to build it for this particular environment. So the version we use now, effectively ENS2, has significant differences from DNS, but it still draws a lot of inspiration in terms of its overall structure. Like I said earlier, our main goal is to eliminate blockchain identifiers. That said, ENS is designed as a generic, general purpose naming system. So to some degree, it can replace the functions of DNS. In fact, we have people working on integrations that make it possible to insert DNS records into ENS and host them on the Ethereum blockchain. But we're not really seeking to replace the entire DNS hierarchy. We'd rather solve our own problems first, and we'd rather sort of extend and improve DNS where it's possible to do so with things like more reliability for name resolution, than to try and go out and wholesale replace one of the fundamental building blocks of the internet.
Great. And yeah, something that comes to mind when thinking about domains and name servers is websites, right? Hosting your website and obtaining a domain. So what ENS is doing is it's replacing that long Ethereum address with a human readable name. An example of this might be josemota.eth instead of having that long string of numbers and letters as an Ethereum address. And this definitely helps address that user experience. But something that I had here to discuss a little bit later on, but I guess we'll cover it, is there's some pretty amazing integrations that you can have with ENS, and some of that involves integrations with IPFS and Swarm. So can you host a website? Not host a website, but can you use the domain as in the same way as using a website? So you have josemota.eth. Can I have that set up as a website?
You can, yes. So Swarm uses ENS as its naming system. So anytime you interact with the Swarm gateway, or if you run a Swarm node on your own machine, Swarm identifiers are all ENS addresses. So you can enter an ENS address into the gateway, and it will look it up via ENS. And we also have support for IPFS integration. So if you have MetaMask installed and you go to a .eth site that has got an IPFS content hash stuck into ENS, then MetaMask will resolve that for you. And we're actually in the middle of transitioning over to a new way of representing these resources so that both Swarm and IPFS can be represented in the same way. And we're hoping that MetaMask and others will adopt that as the new standard for referencing sort of decentralized web content, so we can have a more unified experience for everyone.
Great, and I think that's the EIP 1577. That's sort of the
Right?
standard for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll link that down below for those of you that want to look into that a little bit more. Some pretty amazing stuff. I've seen tweets of people already hosting content via IPFS and Swarm. But let's talk a little bit about the domain registration process and how somebody can get started if somebody wants to get their name.eth and replace their long Ethereum address with that. Let's talk about a little bit about the registration process and how you guys have shifted over from something that's called the Vickery auction process. So can you tell us a little bit about the Vickery auction and why you guys are transitioning over to a newer process?
Yeah, so when we launched DNS 2 years ago, we launched with only one top-level domain, .eth, and a system for allocating those domains that was based on what's called a Vickery auction. So the way it works is if you want a .eth domain, you place a bid for that domain, but your bid is a secret. Nobody can see what name you're bidding on or how much you're bidding. And then you have a reveal phase for every auction where you reveal your bid, and everyone else who bid on the same name has to reveal it as well. And at that phase, you find out who bid the most, and you assign ownership of the domain to the person who bid the most, but you only charge them the amount of the second highest bidder. It's called a vicary auction or a second price auction. And the idea is that it finds the optimum price because you're incentivized to bid the maximum you'd be willing to pay, not the amount you guess somebody else will pay plus a tiny bit. And that worked really well for the initial allocation of names when, there's sort of a land rush to get all the names as they first came out. In that, it helped assign the names to the people who wanted them most. But now that we're in sort of steady state operation, there's no new names becoming available. Every name is available for registration. We have this issue that it's a fairly complex process. It involves 3 transactions, each of which, or 2 of which, have to be executed in a certain time window. You've got 3 days to bid and 2 days to reveal. If you miss the time windows, then potentially you can end up losing the money for your bid because the way vicary auctions are structured, we have to prevent people from revealing late or not at all. And so it's not the sort of most user-friendly process for people. And so we always launched the initial registrar with the goal that it was an interim solution. We wanted to sort of learn from our experiences and see what worked and what didn't. And we've been using the 2 years since it launched to design and build the new registrar. And we're planning to launch that on the 4th of May, Star Wars Day. And the goal is that it will replace the current auction registrar with a much simpler system where you can simply pick an unused name and register it for a fixed yearly fee, much the same as DNS domains today.
Great. And was the primary incentive for starting off with the victory process to sort of avoid squatters, and by squatters meaning people that are just trying to get as many domains as they can to resell later?
Yeah, so that was definitely, basically, we wanted to minimize the sort of land rush effect where, the person who gets the domain is simply whoever got in first, which in the blockchain world basically means they were there at the right time and they used a higher gas price than everyone else. As we saw with, some early token sales, that tends to lead to really unpleasant effects for both the network and the individuals concerned. It wastes a lot of resources. It doesn't result in optimal outcomes. So using an auction was aimed to reduce that effect, to give people time to act and to make sure that one person couldn't snap up a lot of names just by virtue of being first. And the way we dealt with the auction proceeds was also designed to try and discourage squatting. With the existing registrar, the auction one, what happens is if you win, your winning bids are locked up in a contract, and you can actually have those funds back if you release control of the name. So if you no longer require the name, you can give it back so that other people can use it, and then you get your entire deposit back. And the idea is then that it's a sort of an interest cost, an opportunity cost, rather than a capital cost. And that was also intended to prevent squatting, but it backfired a little bit because squatters buy a name with the intention of selling it on. And if they do succeed in selling it on, then they recover that deposit. They charge the eventual buyer that deposit and they get it back. If they don't succeed in selling it on, they can just release it and get their deposit back. A legitimate user who wants to keep the name indefinitely basically has to write that money off because it's going to be tied up for as long as they, retain ownership of the name. So it didn't really serve its desired goal to the degree we'd like. I mean, certainly charging a fee reduced squatting over, say, a lower fee or over making it free. So we haven't seen a lot of sort of namespace pollution, but it also hasn't had the discouraging effect that we wanted. And that's part of the reason we're switching to a rent-based system now.
Great. So base register is the new process that's going to be implemented on May the 4th. But today it's currently on the victory auction. So with that, once the sort of the ETH gets locked up, how long is the domain kept for? How long is that ETH locked up for?
So under the current system, it's locked for as long as you want to keep the name. So you can retain the name, indefinitely or until, the registrar is replaced, like we're planning to do in May. And all you have to do to keep it is not take your money back, basically.
Okay, great. And so once it moves on to, so let's talk a little bit more about base register. So there is no bidding on the new process.
That's right. So To register a name in the new process, there's still unfortunately 2 steps required because of front running, but it's a very simple registration process. Basically, you pick the name you want, you send a first transaction to sort of reserve the name, and then 10 minutes later you send a second transaction to actually get the name. The big difference between this and the auction process is that the timelines are a lot shorter. So the minimum wait is just 10 minutes. There's no funds locked up. So if you send the first transaction and you get distracted and go make yourself a cup of tea and forget about it, the worst you lose out on is the cost of that transaction, which is just a little bit of gas fee, a fraction of a cent ideally. And so it's a lot more friendly to sort of user mistakes. And it doesn't require that you outbid other people. The assumption is that most people, most domains are only going to be registered by sort of one person. They're not going to be competed for. There's no reason that foo.eth would suddenly become popular today of all days when for the last 2 years nobody had wanted it.
Great. So it's on a first come first served basis. Whoever gets to the domain first and it's available and registers it, it's theirs.
Precisely, yes. And if it weren't for blockchain front running, we would have made it just a single, simple give me this name transaction. But in order to prevent somebody spying on the transaction pool and looking for names you're about to buy and then buying them out from under you and selling them back for a profit, we had to use a sort of a pre-commitment scheme. So in the first transaction, you're basically saying you're submitting a closed message, a secret saying, I want to register this name. And in the second transaction, you're revealing that message that proves that 10 minutes ago you wanted to register this name. And unless somebody else can prove that they also wanted to register it 10 minutes ago, and there's no way for them to do so because they didn't know until just now what you were registering, then you're the one who gets it.
Great. So is that registration fee the same fee for all domains?
So yes, so at the moment, just like with the original registrar, the shortest name you can register is 7 letters long. And for all names that are 7 letters long or longer, the registration fee is currently set at $5 a year. And those funds go into the same multi-sig that governs the root of ENS, the sort of top level domain. And it'll be up to them to sort of disperse funds to projects, that enhance ENS and help move the ecosystem forward.
Right. And another major difference between the Victory auction and base register is that with the Victory auction, as you mentioned earlier, people that do stake whatever amount to get that domain can get it back after they release sort of the domain. It's a different case with base register, right? What happens to the fee? Does it get burned, or is that I think that's where it might be for the foundation?
Yeah, so the fee goes to get sent to the multi-sig that controls the ENS route. So that's made up of 7, we think, trustworthy individuals in the Ethereum community. Previously, their job has only been deciding when to upgrade ENS, which has happened, maybe a couple of times over the last 2 years. With this, they will also be in charge of the funds raised from the registrar. And the idea is that they will transparently, consider proposals to disperse the funds to projects that are helping enhance ENS. And we hope, of course, that will include True Names, the company that, the non-profit rather, that is, run by myself and that is currently handling all the ENS development efforts.
Great. And with the new process, is it the once somebody registers a domain, do they have to come back to redo the domain, or can they set up sort of an auto renew process?
So you do have to renew the domain. We can't, like with blockchain constraints, we can't auto renew, but it is configured so that you can renew for any duration you want. So if you want to come back every 30 days and renew your domain, you can do that. But on the other hand, if you want to prepay a century's worth of registration and then just forget about it and leave it in your will, you can do that as well.
Great. And another, I guess, benefit of owning your own domain, which we haven't discussed yet, are subdomains. So if you own your own domain, you can have other Ethereum addresses have their own subdomain. You can get one of those for free today, and there's other ones that charge you a small fee. Can you tell us a little bit about subdomains and how somebody can go about creating them?
Yeah, absolutely. So ENS is fundamentally a hierarchical system like DNS, and if you own a domain like foo.eth, you have complete control over that, and that includes creating subdomains and sub-subdomains and so on and so forth into eternity. And you can assign ownership of those subdomains to other users, and then they can also create subdomains. They can also set them up just like anything else. And so, in order to facilitate that, we've set up, for instance, now.ens.domains, which is a site that lets you instantly, with a single transaction, register a subdomain of your choice. As you say, some of them are free, some of them charge a nominal one-off fee of a couple of dollars, after which the name is yours indefinitely. There are others that are doing this as well. For instance, Gitcoin have set up a subdomain registrar so that anyone with a GitHub account can have their account name .gitcoin.eth, and you can do that fee free.
Great. So one difference with the subdomains is those are given to the user indefinitely.
Yeah, so that's up. Really, it's up to the domain owner. So if Gitcoin could have, for instance, charged a yearly fee, same as .eth, but they've chosen to just give them away.
Great. And we've mainly just been talking about .eth and registering domains on ENS, but ENS goes beyond just .eth and registering domain. What are some of the services or what are some of the potential uses of ENS that you guys see coming in the future, or something that you guys are working on today?
So one of our other big efforts, as you say, is ENS is not just .eth. One of our other big efforts has been integration with DNS in the form of recognizing DNS domains and bringing them into ENS. So we've had this launched on mainnet with the .xyz top level domain since last September, and we're just about ready to roll this out to all the other top level domains. The way it works is that if you own a domain, a DNS domain, you can insert a text record into your domain saying, I want to claim this inside ENS. You can enable something called DNSSEC, which is a system for securely proving the contents of names and the contents of DNS records. And then you can use a tool to bring that name into ENS, at which point you can use it in ENS just like a .eth domain. So you can go to say my Ether wallet or my crypto or MetaMask, and you can send funds to, for instance, myname.xyz. And in fact, a bit of a shout out to Argent Wallet, who recently launched with argent.xyz as their main ENS name. So you can sign up for subdomains under that, and it gives you the same name that you've got in DNS.
Good. So that was something you announced like late quarter three, quarter four last year with the .xyz. It looks like it's been successful. So when can we hope to see the other TLD integrations? Is that like in the coming months?
Yes, very soon. So recently, about a week and a half ago, we deployed the new integration for all top level domains to the Gorli test network. So it's testable there. And we're going to roll out the new support on the main network in probably the next couple of weeks, because we just got the audit back from Consensus Diligence. Consensus very kindly agreed to do a pro bono review of the new registrar and of the new change to the root to support all these TLDs. And so now that we've got that back, we're hoping to roll it out very soon indeed.
Great, definitely looking forward to that. And another thing that you guys offer for developers is the .test, which is meant for developer testing. Can you tell us about what .test is used for, and or
Yeah.
how to
So
obtain it as well?
yep. So on all of the test networks that we support, which is Kovan and Rinkeby, you can use the native ENS registrar there, and you can ask it for a .test domain. You simply send a request for the .test domain you want, and it gives it to you in a single transaction. And you can then use that domain for 28 days. After 28 days, you can ask for it again, or somebody else could claim it. The idea is that they're strictly sort of for temporary use. And we recently added UI support for this to our manager. So I haven't mentioned it before, but if you go to manager.ens.domains, it's a complete tool for managing all of your ENS records. If you load that up and you go to any test network, for instance, with MetaMask in your browser, then enter a name that you want to register, foo.test, and it will show you a button there on the page giving you the info. If it's available, you can just click it and it will register it for you instantly.
Great. And before I get into what dApps should do if they want to integrate ENS and what integrations exist, something um, that I missed was the update that you guys have for 3 to 6 character domain names.
Yep.
I think you guys announced an update at ETHCC in Paris, that this is something that's coming soon. So can you tell us a little bit about when we can expect to be able to obtain those 3 to 6 letter or character domains?
Yep. So the restriction on the length of domains is also something that was part of our rollout strategy. Basically, we recognized that when we launched ENS, not a lot of people knew about it, and we didn't want all of the really short, really useful and valuable names being snapped up immediately by the few participants who are aware of it. So we've been sort of holding those back so nobody can register them until we feel the system's mature enough that that they'll get fairly allocated. And we think that now is probably a reasonably good time. So the plan is that after we've launched the new registrar on May the 4th, we're going to have an allocation process for shorter names. And the way it will work is like this. First of all, if you have an existing domain name that is 6 characters or shorter, you can submit an application to claim the same .eth name. So if you have, say your status and you've got status.io, you can say we would like status.eth. And if multiple people want to claim the same short name based on their existing DNS ownership, then whoever's owned a name for the longest will be assigned it. And for any remaining names that haven't been claimed at that point, they'll be auctioned off using a process very much the same as the current auction registrar. So it'll be a Vickery auction with the highest bidder winning, but the funds will go to the multi-sig, just like the registration funds, for them to distribute amongst projects.
Great. So it'll start off as as an application process where if you own that domain, you can apply to obtain it.
Yes, we went back and forth on this a lot. We talked to the community, we talked amongst each other. It's problematic because we don't want. We really want existing projects that have a profile in the space to be able to get their .eth name, because we think that's really important both for us and for them. For them, it makes ENS more useful. It makes it more attractive for them to integrate it, which is good for us as well. But on the other hand, it was really difficult to come up with something that was reasonably objective, that would be agreed to be, fair and impartial, and was also not vastly complicated for us to administer. How do you assess, worldwide trademark ownership, or how do you assess whether something's really a product or just like a random web page someone threw up? So in the end, we've gone for what we think is the simplest approach that can work, which is if you own a domain on DNS, then you can have the corresponding domain on ENS. And if multiple people compete, then the person who's owned it for the longest can have it.
Great. And does the registration fee apply to those to initial submissions?
Yes. So we haven't set it in concrete yet, but we're anticipating probably will a registration through the pre-process will cost basically 2 years worth of registration fees, and you'll then have the name reserved for you for 1 year. So there'll be an additional fee for the sort of the overhead of doing the whole thing. And also, we have a sort of a tiered pricing in that 3-letter names will be substantially more expensive than normal. 4-letter names will be moderately more expensive than normal, and everything longer than that will just be $5 a year.
Great. So what's sort of the timeline of when the application will be open? You mentioned May the 4th, and how long would it be open for to where people can apply?
So we'll probably launch applications about 30 to 60 days after launching the new registrar. So that would be June or July, and it'll be open for at least 30 days before we close it and we run the auction for the remaining names.
Great. So about a month later, and the Victory auction will run around the same time.
Yes, it'll be
Right.
the auction will be after the pre-registration process is finished.
Great, and I think that covers everything from registering a domain. Luckily, the process is much more simpler to register a domain. You don't have to come back within a 2 day window to reveal your bid, and after winning, you still have to come back and perform another transaction. And so, very very excited that that you guys have been working on this. And with this comes integrations in the space. Something I want to talk about is if there's app developers that want to integrate Ethereum Name Service into their dApp, or if there's existing platforms that want to integrate this, what's the best way to do it? How can they integrate this into their platform?
So, amongst the other things we've been relaunching, we've just finished rewriting our docs. So we believe they're a lot easier to follow. They're a lot better structured now. If you go to docs.ens.domains, we have a complete sort of description of how ENS works, but we also have sort of a getting started guide there. So if you're interested in adding ENS to your dApp, I'd suggest going to docs.ens.domains. And then under the dApp developer guide, there's a section called ENS enabling your dApp. And that describes in sort of 3 short sections what the 3 main things you can do to add ENS support to your dApp are, and how you can get started with that.
Great, and I'll link that down below as well. So as far as integrations that some apps have already implemented, are there anything that comes to mind as far as either recent integrations that you've seen with ENS?
So we have a fairly complete list on our website, sort of categorized by type of application. And in fact, if you're listening and you're working on an app that has ENS support, please ping us. I'm Nick at ens.domains, and we'll happily add you to it. Where most of the major wallets, such as MetaMask, Mist, my crypto and my Ether wallet, Status, and so forth, all support ENS directly. Most of the mobile wallets do as well. And some of the dApps do, but support there and with exchanges has been a little more limited so far. So one of our main efforts is to push out support to dApps and exchanges more. We've got a couple of ways we're doing that. One is more and more libraries have direct ENS support. So for instance, if you're using web3.js already, it has ENS support baked in. You don't need to include a third-party library. You can simply call a couple of functions that are already there, and it works. And in fact, if you're using, for instance, ethers.js, you don't even have to do that. Anywhere that accepts an address automatically accepts an ENS name. In terms of recent integrations, my memory is terrible. Argent, as I mentioned earlier, comes to mind because they're launching with integration using their .xyz domain. So I think they're one of the first people to use that sort of in anger on mainnet, I guess. We've been seeing sort of a lot of activity from people working on it lately, a lot of hackathons and so forth. And I'm really keen to sort of see what comes out of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think once we see additional integrations, especially in these exchanges, I think that'll be a really exciting time. But yeah, you know, very excited to see that you guys have been working on this, and this is definitely a step forward towards improving user experience in blockchain. And what I wanted to end the podcast with is to ask you, what advice would you give to other dApp developers or developers in the blockchain space in regards to enhancing user experience on their project?
So Taylor Monahan recently tweeted a list of basically every step that was required to go from completely new user to actually using an app, and it was something like 37 steps long. And I would say if you're building a dApp, the first thing you should do is make up a list of your own. Walk yourself through everything that's needed to go from no involvement in crypto to making your first useful transaction in your app. List out every single step. And then secondly, find ways you can eliminate steps from that list. I mean, as somebody joked, okay, sure, I can eliminate one step. I just won't back up my seed phrase. Don't do that. Find things you can safely eliminate from it. And if you can eliminate even one step for everybody, you've made the entire crypto usability system easier. And if you can eliminate it for your app, then you've made your app more attractive than every other app to use. So absolutely think very hard about what the usability barriers are and actually explicitly list them out rather than just walking through it in your head. And you'll find there's more of them than you think they are, but that some of them are surprisingly easy to tackle.
Great, and you guys at ENS have definitely cut down some of those steps. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of OST Live. I'll go ahead and link down some of the docs to what we discussed today down in the description below. Other than that, if you're new to OST Live, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We feature weekly guests to discuss the latest in blockchain, and we're happy to have you guys view us live. This will be posted later on the podcast applications, so you guys can tune into this from your favorite podcast app. Nick, thanks so much for joining us on OC Live.
It was my pleasure.